Why did you fully pay for Heather's college but told me to figure it out? The silence that followed my question was deafening. My mom froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. My dad swallowed hard, eyes wide in a way I'd never seen before. My sister Heather, always confident and talkative, suddenly found her lasagna plate incredibly interesting. 5 seconds earlier, I had announced that I won $5.2 million in the lottery. 3 months ago, I had bought a ticket on a whim after a particularly exhausting day balancing my full-time job and night classes at the community college. And now, seeing the shock and sudden interest in my family's eyes, the same family who told me 2 years ago that I'd have to make it work while celebrating every one of Heather's accomplishments with parties and gifts, I finally asked the question I'd swallowed my whole life. Are you wondering how we got here? And more importantly, what happened next? This is the story of how a lottery ticket didn't just change my finances. It revealed family truths no one was ready to face. My earliest memories of unfairness go back to when I was 6 and Heather was 4. I clearly remember my parents announcing that Heather would be starting ballet classes. "Can I do ballet too?" I asked excitedly. My dad patted my head. "Andrea, sweetheart, ballet is expensive. Heather has a natural talent for dance. You're more practical. How about helping mommy? With the cookies?" That pattern repeated constantly. Heather got piano lessons. I got a music-themed coloring book. Heather went to amazing summer camps. I stayed with Aunt Judith to keep her company. Heather joined foreign exchange programs. I got a part-time job at the family's furniture store to learn responsibility. The justification always changed slightly, but the theme stayed the same. Heather was the special one, the one with extraordinary potential. I was the practical one, the one who adapted well. For many years, I accepted that narrative. Maybe they were right. Maybe Heather really did have something I didn't. I became exactly what they expected: responsible, independent, grounded. The daughter who never caused trouble, who never asked for much. Then, at 18, I was accepted to State University for Business Administration. It wasn't Ivy League, but it was respectable, and I had worked hard to get in. I showed the letter to my parents during dinner, hoping for at least some acknowledgement. "Look, I got accepted to State," I announced, holding out the official letter. "That's nice, honey," my mom replied, glancing quickly at my dad. "About the costs," I began hesitantly. "I know it's not as expensive as the law school Heather's going to, but—" "Andrea," my dad interrupted, setting down his fork. "You've always been independent, the practical one. Heather needs this boost for her law career. With your work ethic, I'm sure you can manage school and a job. You'll do just fine on your own." The contrast couldn't have been starker. 3 months earlier, when Heather was accepted into her elite university, my parents threw a party. They bought her a new car. To help her settle in, they explained. They promised to pay for everything: tuition, housing, books, even a generous monthly allowance. For me, there was a pat on the back and the expectation that I'd figure it out. They're my parents, but sometimes I just want to scream at them until they go deaf, I vented to Camilla, my best friend since high school, while we were meal prepping in her small apartment. Camilla, always blunt, looked me straight in the eye. "Then scream. Tell them how you feel. Tell them it's unfair." "They probably don't even realize what they're doing," I replied, repeating the excuse I had come up with to justify their behavior. "Besides, maybe they're right. Heather's always been the brilliant one." "That's ridiculous." "And you know it!" Camilla shot back, waving a wooden spoon at me. "You're on the college honor roll while working 40 hours a week. Imagine what you could do with half the opportunities your sister had." She was right, but confronting my parents would mean facing a painful truth. They simply valued Heather more than they valued me. And what daughter is ever ready to accept that? Instead of confrontation, I chose determination. I worked as an administrative assistant at an insurance company during the day, attended classes at night, and studied in the early mornings and on weekends. I lived in a tiny apartment shared with 2 other students, counted every penny, and still managed to maintain excellent grades. Meanwhile, Heather's Instagram overflowed with pictures of college parties, spring break getaways at resorts, and selfies from prestigious internships she landed through our parents' connections. "How's Heather?" was always the first question at Sunday dinners, followed by 40 minutes of discussion about her latest accomplishments. When they finally asked about me, they barely listened before shifting the conversation back to their favorite subject. Heather was invited to a summer program in Washington, my mom announced excitedly during one of those dinners. "William, we'll need to help her with rent over there." "Of course," my dad immediately agreed. "It's an investment in her future." "I got promoted to executive assistant," I mentioned during a pause. "It comes with a small raise that will help cover next semester's tuition." "That's nice, dear," my mom replied distractedly. "Oh, I almost forgot to tell you what her constitutional law professor said about Heather's paper." It was Martin Chen, my coworker who eventually became a mentor and friend, who helped me see the situation in a new light. Martin came from a family with a similar dynamic, always overshadowed by a younger sibling his parents considered a prodigy. "You know what the irony is, Andrea?" he said one day while helping me study for a finance exam after hours. "People like us develop skills the favorites never have to learn. Resilience, creativity with limited resources, perseverance. In the long run, those skills are more valuable than any opportunity handed to you on a silver platter." "It still hurts," I admitted. "Of course it does," he agreed. "But the real test of character isn't what people do to us. It's how we respond. You're building something from scratch, on your own merit. That's worth more than anything your parents could ever buy for your sister." His words were a balm I didn't know I needed. For the first time, I began to see my struggle not just as an injustice, but as a process of strengthening that, ironically, my parents had denied Heather. Professor Robert Winters, my mentor at community college, reinforced that perspective when he advised me on transferring to a full bachelor's degree program. "You have something that can't be taught, Andrea," he said after reviewing my impressive academic record. "Determination. I've seen students with far more resources accomplish far less. Keep going like this, and they'll have no choice but to recognize your value." "Who's they?" I asked. He smiled gently. "Everyone who ever doubted you." The day that changed my life began like any other, exhausting. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., reviewed notes from the previous night's class over a rushed breakfast, and got to the office by 7:45 to organize the day's meeting schedule before my boss arrived. 10 hours of administrative work, a sandwich eaten at my desk, an irritated call from my mom asking if I could loan some money for a surprise gift for Heather, and then straight to my evening class on advanced accounting. By 9:40 p.m., when class ended, I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. The gas tank in my 15-year-old car was nearly empty. I'd have to wait until payday on Friday to fill it up completely. I stopped at a convenience store to buy the cheapest coffee they had, hoping the caffeine would keep me awake long enough to study a few more hours. "Want to try your luck?" "Special drawing tonight, jackpot's high," the sleepy cashier said, pointing to a poster about the state lottery. Normally, I would have said no. Every dollar in my budget was accounted for, allocated to a specific need. Spending money on a lottery ticket seemed like the kind of frivolous decision I simply couldn't afford. Maybe it was exhaustion clouding my judgment. Or maybe the universe was nudging me toward a decision that would change everything. "Why not?" I said, setting aside $5, money that should have gone toward my lunch the next day. "One ticket, please." I stuffed the ticket into my pocket without even checking the numbers and headed home, where 3 hours of studying and only 4 hours of sleep awaited me before the cycle would start all over again. It wasn't until the following night, in between sips of yet another cheap coffee and cramming for an exam, that I got the notification on my phone, the winning numbers. Out of pure curiosity, I pulled the crumpled ticket from the pocket of the jacket I'd worn the day before. First number, match. Second number, match. My heart started racing as I checked each digit. Third, fourth, fifth, all 6 matched. I checked again and again. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold my phone. I had won. And it wasn't one of those small prizes that barely cover a few months' rent. I had won the entire jackpot. After taxes, roughly $5.2 million. My first reaction wasn't to scream in joy or run to tell someone. It was to sit completely still, in absolute shock. My entire life had been defined by scarcity, by the need to stretch every dollar, to sacrifice comfort for necessity, to delay gratification. And now, in an instant, that reality had been completely upended. I called the only person who made sense in that moment, Camilla. "If this is a joke, it's in really bad taste," she said when I told her. "It's not a joke. I'm looking at the ticket right now." There was a moment of silence, then a scream so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Oh my God! Andrea! You're rich!" "I think so," I replied, still trying to process it. "I need to officially verify it, but..." "Wait, does your family know?" Camilla asked, suddenly serious. "No, you're the first person I've told." Another pause. "Don't tell them yet," she advised, with that instinct I've always admired. "They'll go nuts, especially considering how they've always treated you." She was right, of course. My fleeting fantasies of throwing the money in their faces, "Look what your practical daughter accomplished," were quickly replaced by a sobering understanding of the situation. This was too big, too important to use as a tool for revenge or validation. "You're right," I agreed. "I need to think about what to do." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Following online advice, I consulted a lawyer who specialized in lottery winners before even claiming the prize. He guided me to set up a trust to receive the money, protecting my identity and creating legal safeguards. The lawyer introduced me to a forensic accountant and a financial advisor, both of whom specialized in managing sudden wealth. The statistics were grim. Most lottery winners go broke within 5 years. "It's all about mindset," explained Rachel, the financial advisor. "People who've always lived with limitations suddenly don't have any, and they haven't developed the skills to manage abundance. But something tells me you're different." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You didn't run out to buy luxury cars or mansions. You're here, planning carefully. That already puts you ahead of most." With the team of experts, I developed a full financial plan. Most of the winnings would be conservatively invested to generate sustainable, long-term income. A portion would be set aside for my full education, not just to finish my bachelor's in business administration, but also an MBA from a top-tier institution, something I never even dared to dream of before. Another portion would go toward starting an educational foundation for first-generation students facing financial hardships, young people like me, full of potential but lacking support. The rest would be kept as an emergency fund and for a few small indulgences. The plan didn't include mansions, sports cars, or extravagant jewelry. In fact, the only immediate luxury would be quitting my job to dedicate myself fully to my studies, a luxury that seemed almost impossible to imagine after years of chronic exhaustion. Aunt Judith was the only other person I confided in. As my father's sister, she had always observed the family dynamics with a critical eye, often being my sole ally. "Don't tell your parents yet," she advised, echoing Camilla. "William and Diane, they'll see this as a solution to their problems, not as your opportunity." "What problems?" I asked, confused. As far as I knew, the family furniture store was thriving, and they'd never mentioned financial difficulties, especially considering how much they spent on Heather. Aunt Judith hesitated. "It's not really my place to say, but the store isn't doing as well as they make it seem. They've been dipping into their savings to keep up appearances and to fund Heather's lifestyle. It's a house of cards waiting to collapse." That information hit me like a punch. All that time they told me they couldn't help me financially. Was it not because they valued Heather more, but because they had made terrible financial decisions? "How long should I wait to tell them?" I asked. "Until everything is legally protected," Judith replied. "And until you're crystal clear on your boundaries, because believe me, they're going to test them." 3 months passed. The legal structure was in place. The money was secured in investments and protected funds. My plan had been meticulously laid out with professional help. During that time, I kept my regular routine: work, school, the occasional appearance at family events. It was surprisingly easy to pretend nothing had changed, maybe because my family rarely paid enough attention to notice any subtle difference in my behavior. The only change I allowed myself was to reduce my work hours to 30 per week, telling my boss I wanted to focus more on school. With the reduced stress, my already excellent grades improved even more, and I was named to the dean's list at the Berkshire Community College. The moment of revelation came during Sunday dinner at my parents' house. Heather was home for the weekend, showing off photos from her summer program in Washington and excitedly discussing her plans for an international internship next year. "It'll be such an amazing opportunity," she explained as my mom served dessert. "But the costs are insane. Rent in Geneva is outrageous, and the program itself has these ridiculous admin fees." "We'll figure it out," my dad assured her, though I noticed a subtle tension in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Could Aunt Judith have been right about their financial troubles? "Actually," I said, seizing the perfect moment, "I have an announcement to make." 3 pairs of eyes turned to me, surprised as always, when I interrupted Heather's spotlight. "I won the lottery a few months ago," I announced calmly, as if I were commenting on the weather. "After taxes, it came out to about $5 million. The silence that followed was absolute. My mom dropped her fork. My dad choked on his wine. Heather just stared at me, mouth open. "If this is a joke," my dad began. "It's not a joke," I gently interrupted. "I've already received the money, set up a trust fund, and developed a full financial plan with professional help. Why didn't you tell us earlier?" My mom finally found her voice, somewhere between shocked and hurt. "I needed time to process and plan properly," I replied with the calm I'd learned from watching executives at the office. "I've already set up funds for my education, made some meaningful donations, and invested for the long term." "This is surprising," my dad commented, clearly doing the mental math on what this meant for the family dynamic. "I imagine now you can finally leave that job and transfer to a better university." "Yeah, I'm transferring to the full-time program next semester," I confirmed. "And yes, I'm quitting my job to focus on school." That's when Heather, always blunt, said out loud what everyone else was clearly thinking. "So, you're going to help the family now, right? I mean, my expenses in Geneva are going to be insane, and Mom and Dad are already stretched to the limit." The table fell silent, everyone staring at me expectantly. It was as if my value in the family had suddenly shifted, not because of who I was, but because of the money I now had, and that was the moment I finally asked the question I had swallowed my entire life. "Why did you fully pay for Heather's college, but told me to figure it out?" The silence that followed was deafening. 26 years of unspoken inequality suddenly exposed in a single sentence. My dad was the first to recover, beginning his usual rehearsed response. "Well, Andrea, you've always been more independent, more practical. Heather had different needs, different potential. And now that I have money, my potential changed?" I asked simply. The question hung in the air like an accusation. I watched my parents exchange uncomfortable glances. My mom was fiddling with her napkin, folding it into smaller and smaller shapes. "It's not about potential," my mom finally said, her voice shrinking with every word. "You've always been so capable, so self-sufficient, even as a little girl." "Because I had to be," I replied calmly. "I was never given another option." Heather, to my surprise, looked genuinely disturbed. I didn't realize it was that unfair," she murmured, though it was hard to believe she hadn't noticed. $5 million is a lot of money," my dad said, clearly trying to steer the conversation in a new direction. "You'll need advice to manage it properly. I know some people who could help." "I already have a financial team," I replied. "Advisor? Accountant? Estate lawyer?" "Oh." He seemed slightly disappointed. "Well, that's very responsible of you." An awkward silence settled over the table. Finally, my mom stood up abruptly. "Anyone want more dessert? I made that caramel pudding you love, Heather." The transparent attempt to return to normalcy, where Heather was the center of attention and I was a footnote, was almost comical in its predictability. "Actually," I said, standing up too, "I think I'll get going. I have some things to take care of early tomorrow." "But you barely told us about all of this," my mom protested, gesturing vaguely. "We have so much to talk about. What she really meant was, "We have so much to talk about regarding how your money can benefit us." The thought made me oddly calm. "There'll be time for that," I said. "I just needed you to know." The next morning, the calls began. First my mom, then my dad, even Heather, all suddenly very interested in my life, my decisions, my plans for the future. "I've been thinking," my dad said during our third conversation in 2 days, "maybe you could invest in expanding the store. We've always wanted to open a second location on the north side of town, and now with your resources—" "Interesting," I replied neutrally. "Is the store doing well enough to justify expansion?" A hesitation. "Well, it's been a challenging time in retail, with online competition and all, but with some fresh capital." So Aunt Judith was right. The store was struggling, probably had been for years, while my parents continued to fund Heather's elite education and lavish lifestyle, all while telling me they couldn't help me financially. My mom was more subtle, but just as transparent. "I just want to make sure you're making wise decisions, sweetheart. Sudden money can be overwhelming. Your father and I could help manage a few things for you while you focus on your studies." Heather, surprisingly, was the most direct. "Look, I know it must seem weird for me to ask now, but I really need this internship in Geneva for my career. Mom and Dad are trying to pretend they can afford it, but I heard them arguing about a second mortgage. Maybe you could loan them money. I'll pay you back once I get hired by a big firm." Within a week, it became clear that my family didn't see me as someone who had just experienced a once-in-a-lifetime stroke of luck, but rather as a solution to their financial problems they'd kept from me for years while insisting I figure it out. Aunt Judith called me after getting an irritated phone call from my dad. "Your father is furious you didn't immediately agree to invest in the store," she informed me, sounding almost amused. "Apparently, he expected you to give back to the family now that you finally have means." "Give back what, exactly?" I asked bitterly. "The years of unequal treatment? The missed opportunities? The 'we can't afford it' that apparently meant 'we don't want to pay for you'?" "Exactly," Judith sighed. "Will has always been that way. He thinks the world owes him something. And Diane? Well, she follows wherever he leads. It's always been like that." "What should I do, Aunt Judith?" I asked, suddenly feeling like a child again, seeking guidance. "What do you want to do?" she countered. "That's the most important question. For the first time in your life, you have the power to define the terms of your relationship with them. Use it wisely." A week later, I invited my family to lunch at a neutral restaurant. I didn't want this conversation happening at their house, where I always automatically felt like the voiceless, younger daughter. They arrived together, eager and expectant, in a way I'd never seen when it came to me. To my surprise, Professor Winters and Martin had also come, at my request. I needed allies who truly knew me, not just people seeing me as a potential source of money. "Thank you for coming," I began once our orders were placed. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about the future, mine and our families." My dad nodded encouragingly, clearly expecting an announcement of generous financial support. "First," I continued, "I want you to know I've already decided what to do with the money. I'm establishing a foundation to help first-generation students facing financial hardship. And I'm investing in my own education. I'm transferring into the full-time business administration program, and I plan to get my MBA." My parents exchanged glances, not what they had hoped to hear. "That's admirable," my mom said carefully. "But what about the family's needs? Your father mentioned expanding the store." "About that," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "I'd like to better understand the store's current financial situation. From what I gather, you've been struggling for some time." My dad looked uneasy. "Just normal market fluctuations." "Why didn't you ever tell me? All those years you said you couldn't help with college, but kept paying for everything for Heather?" The silence that followed was telling. "Look," I said finally, my voice softer, "I'm not here to accuse or make anyone feel bad. I'm trying to understand." Martin, sitting beside me, nodded in support. Professor Winters watched closely, as if analyzing the family dynamic. "We did what we thought was best at the time." My dad finally replied, defensive. "Heather had such clear potential in law, She needed that initial boost. You always had more practical skills. We figured you'd adapt better. And it never occurred to you that maybe she could adapt too? That maybe struggling could have helped her grow, the same way you clearly thought it would for me? Heather looked genuinely upset now. Andrea, I didn't know it was that hard for you. How could you? I replied without bitterness. We were living completely different realities. I turned to my parents. As for the store and your financial problems, I'm not just going to hand over money or invest without a clear plan. My dad began to object, but I raised my hand. Instead, I'm offering something different. I've hired a financial consulting firm to evaluate the business and build a recovery plan, and I'm going to pay for both of you to take a financial management course. A course? My dad looked baffled. We've been running this business for decades, and apparently it's on the brink of bankruptcy. I replied calmly, while you keep up appearances and pay for luxury. Experiences for Heather? My mom looked like she was about to cry. Heather stared down at her plate intently. As for you, Heather, I continued, I'm not paying for Geneva. Her face fell. But, I added, I am setting something up for you too. A fund for financial management training, and if you show progress, possibly partial support for future internships, provided you apply for scholarships and work to supplement. You want me to work while studying? She looked genuinely shocked by the idea. Like I've been doing for the past few years, I replied simply. Not out of revenge, but because I believe that experience made me stronger, more resilient, and you deserve the chance to develop those qualities too. Lunch ended in uncomfortable silence. My parents, clearly disappointed I hadn't offered them a generous check to fix their problems, barely spoke during dessert. Heather shifted between looking offended and thoughtful, probably the first time someone in the family had ever directly told her no. Professor Winters, who had watched the entire scene quietly, walked me to my car after the meal. You really surprised them today, he said. That's not what they expected. Maybe I was too harsh, I replied, suddenly unsure. Harsh? No, fair and clear, yes. He adjusted his reading glasses. You know, Andrea, in all my years of teaching, I've seen how people often mistake generosity for weakness, especially when it comes to dysfunctional family dynamics. What you did today was a true act of generosity, offering tools instead of quick fixes. Do you think they'll ever understand that? He smiled gently. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What matters most is that you do. The following days were tense. My dad called once, trying to make me see reason about the store investment, a conversation that ended quickly when I stood my ground. My mom sent several guilt-ridden messages, suggesting I was abandoning the family when they needed me most. The most surprising message came from Heather, 3 days after the lunch. Can we talk? Just the two of us? We met at a small cafe near her campus. When I arrived, Heather was already there, looking strangely vulnerable without her usual overconfidence. Thanks for coming, she said as I sat down. Of course, I replied, unsure what to expect. She fidgeted with her iced coffee. Straw, clearly uncomfortable. I've been thinking a lot since that lunch, about everything, and I realized I never really asked what it was like for you. All these years. Her admission caught me off guard. It was hard, I answered honestly. Working all day, studying at night, trying to stretch every dollar, but more than the physical exhaustion, it was the feeling of not being enough in some fundamental way. Heather nodded slowly. I think I always knew there was an imbalance, but it was easier not to think about it. I just accepted what I was given because, well, who wouldn't? That's fair, I acknowledged. You didn't create the system. You just benefited from it. Still, she hesitated, then met my eyes. I'm sorry, Andrea. For all the times I talked about my trips or parties without thinking about how you felt, for never really asking about your life, for accepting the favoritism like it was normal. The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. All our lives, Heather had been good at getting what she wanted, at manipulating situations to her advantage. But this felt different, genuine. The weirdest thing, she continued, is that ever since you told me about the money, I felt almost jealous. Not of the money itself, but of you. Your strength. You built something on your own. Me? Without Mom and Dad opening doors, who am I really? I nearly laughed at the irony. Heather, who always had everything, feeling envious of me, who always had to fight for scraps. You can still figure that out, I said gently. It's not too late. Is that why you're not paying for Geneva? Basically, I confirmed. It's not a punishment, Heather. It's an opportunity to discover your own strength. She nodded, slowly. I get it now. And even though part of me still wants you to just write a check, a small smile crept across her face. Another part is curious to see what I can accomplish on my own. When we said goodbye, I felt something fundamental had shifted between us. We weren't close friends, and probably wouldn't be anytime soon, but for the first time there was mutual recognition, not just of our differences, but of our shared humanity. In the weeks that followed, I began transitioning into a new life. I quit my admin job, finalized my transfer into the full-time program, and started laying the foundation for the educational nonprofit with Professor Winter's guidance. The year. Financial consulting firm I hired to evaluate my parents' business delivered a thorough report. The news wasn't good. Years of poor financial management, impulsive decisions, and refusal to adapt to market changes had left the store in a fragile state. Without major changes, bankruptcy was only a matter of time. I sent the report along with a letter. Dear Mom, and Dad, attached is the professional analysis of the store's situation. As you can see, the problems are structural and stem from years of decisions that prioritized appearances over sustainability. My offer still stands. I'll pay for the consulting firm to implement the recommended changes and for financial management courses for both of you. This isn't charity. It's an investment in the family's future, including the business that has been our legacy for generations. I love you, even through the hardships and inequalities we've faced. I hope we can build something new from here, something based on honesty and mutual respect, not on expectations and predefined roles. With love, Andrea. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Then one afternoon, while I was settling into my new apartment, modest but comfortable, something I chose for pleasure, not out of financial need, the doorbell rang. My parents were at the door. Somehow they looked smaller, more vulnerable than I had ever seen them. Can we come in? My dad asked, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Sitting in my small living room, with untouched cups of tea, they seemed out of place, visitors in a country whose language they didn't fully speak. You were right, my dad finally said, the words clearly difficult for him. About the store, about a lot of things. We're accepting your offer, my mom quickly added. The consulting, the courses, all of it. I nodded, waiting. There was more that needed to be said. And we'd like to... My dad visibly struggled, apologize, for not being fair to you. The words weren't eloquent, nor did they cover the years of favoritism and neglect. But they represented perhaps the best my father could manage at that moment, a recognition that something had been deeply wrong, that he had failed in important ways. Thank you, I said simply. It means a lot to hear that. We never meant to hurt you, my mother added, tears in her eyes. We just got used to seeing you a certain way, the strong one, the independent one, and Heather as the one who needed protection. We never stopped to ask if those roles were fair, or if we had created them ourselves. It was the most honest admission I'd ever heard from her. We'd like to try again, my father said hesitantly, in a different way. In that moment, I felt something I didn't expect. Not full forgiveness, nor lingering resentment, but something in between. A cautious willingness to build something new. I'd like that too, I replied. 1 year later, Andrea Morgan? The academic secretary's voice echoed through the packed auditorium. Adjusting my gown and cap, I walked across the stage to receive my bachelor's degree in business administration, graduated with highest honors. From the audience, I heard enthusiastic applause. My parents, Aunt Judith, Professor Winters, Martin, and Camilla, all cheering as if I had achieved the impossible. And in a way, I had. Heather was there too, having recently returned from a semester abroad. Not the luxury program in Geneva, but a more modest internship she'd landed on her own, working 20 hours a week to help cover expenses. In her own words, it had been the hardest and most rewarding experience of her life. The family furniture store was slowly recovering, now under professional management. My parents, after initial resistance, had finally embraced the consultant's recommendations, modernizing operations and adapting to the new realities of the market. The financial management course had opened their eyes to years of problematic practices. Our family dynamic had shifted. Not perfect, certainly, with occasional tension and old patterns still resurfacing from time to time, but fundamentally different, more honest, more balanced. At a celebratory dinner after graduation, my father raised his glass in a toast. "To Andrea," he began, his voice slightly trembling, "who's always been the strong one, the independent one, not because we needed her to be, but because that's who she is. We made mistakes as parents, favoring one daughter over the other. But you, Andrea, turned adversity into strength, not because of the lottery money, but in spite of it." His eyes met mine with a vulnerability and admiration I had never seen before. "You've taught us more than we could have ever taught you," he finished. Later that night, walking across campus one last time before heading off to the MBA program. I'd begin in the fall. I reflected on the extraordinary journey the last 18 months had been. Winning the lottery had changed my life, no doubt. But not in the way I first imagined. It wasn't the material wealth that caused the most profound transformation. It was the shift in power dynamics, the opportunity to finally be seen and heard within my own family. As for the educational foundation I'd created, it had already awarded its first 10 scholarships to driven young people who, like me, were trying to navigate higher education with limited resources and little to no family support. In my letter to the scholarship recipients, I had written words that I'll now repeat to you. When my parents paid my sister's college tuition in full but told me to figure it out, I learned a lesson in self-reliance that no classroom could ever teach. Winning the lottery wasn't what changed my life. It was realizing that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's validation, not even my family's. Sometimes the greatest gift we receive from those who underestimate us is the determination to prove, first and foremost to ourselves, that we're capable of far more than they ever imagined.